Howdy, everybody. So we are going to be talking about kind of Washington's first presidency, in which Hamilton plays a huge role in the rise of the two-party system, which was primarily the result of Hamilton's economic policy, which we'll talk about in just a second, and kind of the opposition coming from Thomas Jefferson. So let's talk about our first president. So George Washington. Now, he was chosen pretty much by unanimous decision. He didn't really have to run for election. He was basically elected to the office without even campaigning, without anything. He was really the only candidate for many people in America. And he saw this kind of begrudgingly, and he kind of took the job, not because he wanted it, but because he felt it was his duty to take the job. He said on his way to the Capitol that he felt like a man going to the gallows. Now, the gallows is where you hang people. So this is not like his dream job. This is not what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a farmer. He wanted to work on his plantation, manage that. That's what he was focused on, not being president, not being a major politician. But he did it because he felt it was his duty, just like it was his duty to be the general during the American Revolution. Being president was his duty, what he owed his country. Now, starting off, there's four major questions that we need to look at facing this brand new nation. We've created the U.S. Constitution. We've got this second government, kind of the first real government in the United States. And there's four questions facing us. Would the national government under the Constitution be strong enough to deal with the country's problems at home, but not so strong as to take away individual freedoms and destroy the states? So can we deal with issues like Shays' Rebellion or Bacon's Rebellion, these kind of rebellions at home, but not deal with them so harshly that we become this kind of dictatorship or totalitarian government or overbearing like England was? Two, would the U.S. be strong enough to have foreign countries respect our independence and our interests? Would they care what we do? Would we remain an independent nation? Would we be strong enough to fight off any opposition, anyone looking to add the United States to their empire? Would the U.S. under the Constitution continue to evolve as a democratic republic, or would we stop and remain an aristocratic republic? Now, what this means is aristocratic republic, the wealthy, the powerful, these are the ones. We don't have an aristocracy in the United States, but we do have one controlled more heavily by the wealthy and powerful. But would we develop, sorry, my cat's trying to chime in, would we try to develop a more egalitarian system? And finally, would political parties destroy the United States? Now, the issue, starting off with George Washington's first term as president, is there's only one political party, and that's the party of George Washington. Everyone was in support of Washington. Whatever Washington did or said, that is where people went. So, the first capital was in New York City. We hadn't really established what becomes Washington, D.C. later. We'll talk about that in a minute, how we actually get the capital, the official permanent capital. But Washington arrives in the capital and he gets sworn in. And there's a lot of decisions to be made. How are we going to swear him in? What are we going to call the president? All these kinds of things. And they don't really matter too much, but people get bogged down in all the little stuff. We're creating a whole new country, and what we do this first round is going to define what comes next, what everything else is going to be coming after. Now, George Washington is kind of this deified character. We kind of put him up on a pedestal, literally. You kind of see in this statue of George Washington, he's done in kind of the Greek model, where he's sitting there with a toga, looking like he's ruling over, the Romans or the Greeks or something like that. So you do have this kind of weird juxtaposition where there's democratic, Republican society, but we're also have this tie like looking up to George Washington as this larger than life figure. But jumping into Washington's first term as president. So he gets going, starting to create his administration, but the first U.S. Congress has to start doing what they need to do. So there's three major issues they're going to deal with in the first couple of years. The first is the Tariff of 1789, second, the Judiciary Act of 1789, and third, the Bill of Rights. Now, we'll kind of go through these a little quick, particularly the Bill of Rights, because we have a whole second reading online for that. But the Tariff of 1789. Now, when we're talking about tariffs in the United States, we've got to understand at this point in time, we're kind of using tariffs in three major ways. You have a revenue tariff, which is just a small tax on foreign goods to try to raise a little money. And that's what this tariff is going to be. It's just a small revenue tariff trying to bring money into the United States. Because remember, under the Articles, the federal government couldn't tax, no money was coming in, one of the biggest weaknesses. Now we have the ability to tax, pass tariffs, and this is going to be a great revenue source. Second type of tariff is a protective tariff, where you place a fairly high tariff, particularly on foreign goods, that would compete with a good being produced in the United States. This is trying to create competition in the market. So even though American goods might be a little more expensive, if we place a tariff on foreign goods, like English goods that are produced at greater volumes more cheaply, then we can compete. So this is a way to protect American business. And we'll talk about protective tariffs a little bit later. Then you have what's called a prohibitive tariff. And this is designed to stop competition altogether, and mainly to punish a particular foreign country. Now we'll see this when we get into Jefferson's term as president with the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. Those are going to be kind of prohibitive tariffs and prohibitive policies. But in this case, the tariff of 1789 is a revenue tariff. Now, the Judiciary Act of 1789 in the US Constitution, only the Supreme Court is created. So the Judiciary Act is going to create all the different levels of courts. So you have the Supreme Court, which the Constitution created. Then you're going to have circuit courts, which you have about 3 circuit courts at this point in time. And these are going to take several kind of areas. So there's 13 colonies or 13 states now. So each circuit court will cover 3, 4, 5 of those. Then you have district courts. So there's going to be 13 district courts. So you have this spread out, 1 per state. Now the types of courts. You have a court of original jurisdiction. This is where court cases start. So a district court is a court of original jurisdiction. So when you have a problem with something at the federal level, you would go to your district court, plead your court case, and then from there, you would get your decision. Now, if you didn't like the decision at the district court, you could appeal to the next level of court. So these are called court of appeals or appellate courts. Now, circuit court and Supreme Courts are going to be courts of appeals. Now, this is important for what comes up, particularly with the court case of Marbury versus Madison. So keep all this in mind. Now, the Bill of Rights. We're going to run through the 10 amendments, the first 10 amendments. But we're not going to talk about it in depth because that's one of the things you're going to read and discuss on the discussion boards. Now, they passed the Bill of Rights because they promised, the Federalists promised a Bill of Rights to appease the Anti-Federalists and get their support for the creation and ratification of the Constitution. And they didn't have to give a Bill of Rights, but they gave their word, so they were going to live up to the promise. So what they did was they took suggestions from all the state governments, compiled them, combined similar ones, got rid of crazy ones, and then they narrowed it down to a handful. And after the vote in Congress, it is going to be these 10 amendments that go before the states to get ratified. So, the First Amendment. The freedom of speech and religion. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. This is to own weapons. Now, in this context, they're saying the right to bear arms to maintain a well-organized militia. So the militia would like be our National Guard today. No quartering. We can't house soldiers in a house, or at least not a privately owned house. No unlawful search and seizure. You have to have a search warrant. The police have to have a search warrant to come into your car or home. No self-incrimination. So this is whenever you plead the fifth, when you don't want to say anything to incriminate yourself, to make yourself look guilty. A trial by jury. Trial by jury in a federal court. This one doesn't apply as much today. No cruel or unusual punishment. So this does away with kind of crazy corporal punishments. 9, guides the interpretation of the Constitution. It's not as valid or as used as much today. And number 10, this is a huge one. Any rights not stated, so not specifically listed in the Constitution, are held by either the people, the U.S. people, or the states. So just because it's not stated in the Constitution doesn't mean the government can say, oh, we have that too. No, if it's not stated specifically in the Constitution or one of the amendments, the federal government does not have that power. Then those powers are held by the states. And if the state doesn't hold it, the people. People are the repository of any power not claimed by the federal or the state governments. Now keep in mind, in order for the federal or state governments to have a power, the people have to choose to give it up. It's an exchange. We're giving up some of our power in order for the government to be able to protect us and provide for us in other ways. So it's a trade. And it only works as long as that trade is honored. So as long as both sides are doing their part. Oh, my PowerPoint's frozen for a second. There we go. So Hamilton and the Federalist Party. So Hamilton is an interesting guy. So let's talk about Hamilton for just a minute to kind of understand who he is and kind of where he's coming from. So he's honestly going to be more important than Washington in determining what goes on and what happens. Now, Hamilton is named the Secretary of the Treasury. That means he's in charge of all the money. Now, he gets this position because of his connection to Washington. Now, Hamilton wasn't actually born in the United States. He was born in the Virgin Islands, still British territory, but he's going to eventually make his way to the United States later on, or the 13 colonies at that point in time. Now, he starts off very poor, dirt poor. He is an illegitimate child, so he is noble in some regards, but he's illegitimate, so he doesn't really get to claim that title. Now, he's going to work his way up from pretty much nothing, and he's going to become a favorite of George Washington. Washington calls him my boy. And it's about as close to a father and son relationship as you can get without it being actual blood. Now, Hamilton's going to be educated at King's College, Columbia University today. And the war is going to give, the American Revolution is going to give Hamilton a chance to kind of show his prowess to Washington, and he's going to become Washington's aide-de-camp. Now, this is going to be kind of the heart of where Washington and Hamilton get their connection, really bind themselves to each other, and where Washington begins trusting Hamilton implicitly. Virtually whatever Hamilton requests, Washington is going to be willing to give. Now, Hamilton is very much an elitist. He sees the wealthy and the educated as the ones that should be leading the country. And this is going to help shape Hamilton's economic plan, how he sees the future of the United States. He's very scared of the poor, the peasant, the uneducated ruling and having a major impact. So he does like the idea of some democracy, but it needs to be filtered through the lens of the aristocracy. He sees the wealthy, the powerful as a needed filter to make sure the right people are chosen, the right decisions are made. So Hamilton's economic policy can be broken up into kind of four major parts, three of which get passed and a fourth that does not pass. So the first is to assume and fund the state debt. So what this means is to assume and fund the state debt. All the states had acquired some level of debt during the American Revolution, as had the US government, the Articles of Confederation, during the war. Now, some of the states hadn't paid off their debts, so Hamilton wanted those debts assumed and taken in by the federal government, so that a state wasn't looking to a foreign power to pay their debts, and a foreign power wasn't bypassing the federal government to come request money from the states. Now, if a foreign power needs money, they come to the federal government. And on top of that, if we take on a state's debt, that state will basically owe their allegiance to us. So that's the first part, the assuming of the debt. Now the funding part. Hamilton wants to pay the debt off in full. Now he does this. You can pay the lower face value, but he wants to pay it off at the full value because he feels that this will earn him and earn the government a sense of legitimacy. If you're paid everything you're owed, you're going to trust that government far more. So the second part of the plan is to, there we go, the whiskey tax. So the whiskey tax is a tax on whiskey, what's called an excise tax or a luxury tax. Now, whiskey is the most common drink in America by this point in time. It's a way you can get corn from your fields to the market without worrying about it spoiling or going bad or anything like that. And people love drinking. America at this point in time gets dubbed the Alcoholic Republic. There's even a book by that title talking about the early days of alcoholism and drinking in America. So this whiskey tax is going to bring in lots of money into the United States, but it's also not going to be very popular. Then you have the first bank of the US, which is going to be his most controversial idea. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, has the right to create a bank. But despite that, he's going to argue that he has this right. Now, he needs a bank, or says he needs a bank, to help regulate income, to regulate taxes, to regulate the economy, all these kinds of things a bank would be very helpful for. And this is what he's proposing. Now, he does propose a fourth component, and this is going to be a tariff, a protective tariff. There we go. Oh. A protective tariff on American business, because he sees American business, not American agriculture, as the future of the United States. The production that we will have more than agricultural production. So mechanical and factory production over agricultural production. Now, not a lot of people agree with this, and Washington kind of sides with everyone else on this one. You know, Washington's a farmer at heart. So he says, yeah, these tariffs, if we put high tariffs on European goods, the European countries will put high tariffs on our raw goods, and that's going to hurt American farmers. So they kind of killed the protective tariff, but the other three do manage to go through. Now, we have to talk about one more thing in regards to his plan. So, 1 second. Okay. So, strict versus broad construction. So, strict construction or strict interpretation of the Constitution. So, strict construction is when you read the Constitution, you read it only as written. The letter that's written in the Constitution is all the power you have. Hamilton, however, believed in something called broad construction or broad interpretation, where you could kind of read between the lines. There's kind of some phrasing in the Constitution that says, well, maybe we can do a little bit more than what it literally says. Now, there's two clauses in particular that Hamilton's going to point to that says, yes, I have the power to create things like the bank, even though it doesn't specifically say that. So the first is the necessary and proper clause, which said the government can create any organizations and things that are necessary and the proper for administering the government. Now, when Hamilton reads this, necessary and proper reads more as useful and helpful. So, is a bank helpful for a Secretary of the Treasury? Yeah, totally. Now, if Jefferson were to come in and read this, he'd see necessary and proper, and he would read it as, would the government collapse without a bank? And probably not. It'll become more important as we go through history, but at this point, probably not. So Jefferson's going to oppose it because of his strict interpretation, and Hamilton's going to support it and push for it because of broad construction. Then you have a second clause, the general welfare, which says the government can create and do things that will promote the general welfare of the American people. So would a bank be good for the American people? And Hamilton argues, yes, it'll help stabilize the economy, it'll regulate taxes, do a lot of good things. So Jefferson again would say, general welfare means, will the people die without this bank? No, probably not. But it's going to be using these clauses that Hamilton's going to argue in favor of creating a bank and a lot of different things. Now, Jefferson, in exchange for allowing and supporting the bank to be created, he's going to make a trade. And that trade is going to be the capital, the compromise of 1790. What he's compromising is he'll give Hamilton his bank if Hamilton and Washington agree to move the capital kind of into the middle of the country. So take it out of New York and move it further south. And what we get is the creation of the District of Columbia. So Hamilton gets his bank and they fund the debt at full value. You also get what's called the Residency Act, which actually establishes the city, what's going to become the District of Columbia, or Washington, city of Washington in the District of Columbia, which doesn't really belong to Maryland or Virginia. It's this kind of swampy area along the river that is set apart. So it doesn't really belong to either. It's kind of its own little mini state. We're going to choose a guy named Pierre Charles L'Enfant. If you ever go to Washington, D.C. and ride the subway, you'll see L'Enfant Station. And it's named after the guy who helped design the city. And Washington, in a large way, is a planned city. So you can kind of see the different kind of designs of the city as it went through different time periods, kind of different evolutions, and we kind of get to where it is today, where you have kind of the Capitol building on the far right, then you have the mall, which has all the Smithsonian's leading up to the Washington Monument, the reflecting pond, and concluding at the Lincoln Memorial. If you go north a little bit, you see the White House. If you go south a little bit, you see the Jefferson Memorial. So you kind of get this very planned city all starting during this time, and the whole city comes about as a compromise for Hamilton trying to get his economic system through. So Hamilton is going to eventually found what becomes known as the Federalist Party, this much larger form of government, more active, trying to have a larger influence on the American people. They're going to have a broad interpretation of the Constitution. So they're going to read it very loosely, kind of read between the lines a little more. And they're going to be more focused on a British model, kind of mimicking the British system. Hamilton loved the British model. He thought if we could have Washington as president for life, that would be perfect. Now, the final component of the Federalists is a strong emphasis on business. Now, the opposing view is going to come from Jefferson and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, or just the Jeffersonian Republicans. They're going to see, and he in particular is going to see things in a very different light. He's going to follow the French. He says they're our allies. We should side with them more. On top of that, he says our future is not in manufacturing. Instead, our future is with agriculture. We should become an agricultural empire. Jefferson felt that the small yeoman farmer, small average farmer, was particularly good at being an American citizen because by owning your own farm, you're invested, you want to participate, you want to vote. And at this point in time, when Jefferson's talking about all this, land ownership is a big component in getting the right to vote. So you want people to own land, you want them to be small farmers because that's what gives them the right to vote, that's what gives them the ability to participate in the US government. So I'll stop there for today. But I hope this kind of gave you a different variety and a little more information on Hamilton, the economic policies, the creation of the first two-party system, and how we got Washington, D.C. So we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with another lecture next time.